Ethan Grayson opened the door of La Lumière, Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurant, with the confidence of a man who had spent years as one of the most successful CEOs in the financial sector. He adjusted the Rolex on his wrist as he held the door for Vanessa Carter, his new girlfriend. Vanessa, a model frequently gracing magazine covers, entered with the same air of superiority Ethan had come to both admire and tolerate. The ambiance was dazzling, as always. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their light reflecting softly across the impeccably set tables. The aroma of truffle butter and French wine lingered in the air. It was a setting designed to impress, and Ethan always chose settings like this. "It's perfect," Vanessa murmured, sliding her delicate fingers along Ethan's arm. She looked stunning in a red dress that seemed sculpted to her body. He smiled, not out of any genuine feeling, but because it was what was expected of him. Her presence at his side was just another piece of the puzzle that made up his public image. They were led to a central table, strategically positioned to be noticed, but not excessively exposed. Vanessa began talking about next week's charity gala, something about raising funds for an environmental cause. Ethan wasn't paying attention. It wasn't the lack of interest in the conversation. It was that something in his peripheral vision had caught his attention. A waitress moved swiftly across the room, balancing a tray loaded with elegant dishes. Ethan froze. He recognized that face, the deep brown eyes, the soft features, unmistakable, even from a distance. Clara Bennett, his ex-wife. But it wasn't just the shock of seeing her in a place he frequented so often that unsettled him. It was her condition. Beneath the black apron of her uniform, her noticeably swollen belly showed that she was pregnant, very pregnant. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan felt his stomach churn, but his expression remained controlled. Vanessa, busy adjusting the menu in front of her, didn't notice the sudden shift in his demeanor. "Ethan!" Vanessa's voice carried a note of irritation. He tore his gaze away from Clara just in time to avoid suspicion. "Sorry, what did you say?" he asked, feigning attention. "I was saying the Vogue photographer wants to do a couple's shoot with us. Brilliant idea, don't you think?" He nodded automatically, but her words didn't register. While Vanessa kept talking, he stole quick glances at Clara. She looked different from the woman he once knew. There was something about her posture, weary yet resilient, that deeply unsettled him. He remembered her as quiet and reserved, almost invisible amidst his life of meetings, business dinners, and international trips. And now, there she was, just a few feet away, carrying a child. He needed answers. When Clara returned from the back of the restaurant with a bottle of wine for another table, she finally saw him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and the impact was like an electric shock. She nearly dropped the bottle, but quickly recovered, turning toward the table she was serving, head held high. Ethan didn't miss a single movement. "I'm going to the restroom," he muttered to Vanessa, who didn't even look up. Clara was heading to the opposite side of the restaurant when Ethan intercepted her, stepping directly into her path. She stopped abruptly, the tray in her hands almost slipping. "Clara," he said, his voice low but tense. She stared at him, her brown eyes darkening with a mix of surprise and caution. "Mr. Grayson," she replied formally, her tone neutral. "Don't treat me like a stranger," he shot back, his gaze dropping pointedly to her belly. "Is that what I think it is?" Clara straightened her shoulders, gripping the tray firmly in her hands. "I don't know what you think, Ethan." "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You're pregnant. Why am I finding out about this now?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a rehearsed response. "My current condition has nothing to do with you," she said evenly. "This is absurd," he replied, struggling to keep his anger in check. "If this baby is mine, I have a right to know." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "This isn't a conversation we should be having here," she said, her voice quieter now. Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan returned to the table, but his mind was miles away. Vanessa was now busy taking selfies, seemingly content to ignore his mood. But Ethan couldn't ignore it. Clara was pregnant, and he needed to know whose baby it was and why she had kept it from him. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence of Ethan Grayson's penthouse apartment. He stood by the window, staring out at Manhattan's glowing skyline, though his thoughts were far from the view. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand, the ice clinking softly. The image of Clara, pregnant and working as a waitress in a luxury restaurant, wouldn't leave his mind. She had disappeared from his life 5 months ago. Clara had always been pragmatic, even when ending their marriage. There had been no shouting matches or heated arguments, just a sharp silence as she signed the divorce papers and walked out the door. At the time, he'd thought it was exactly what he wanted, freedom to focus on his career, free of distractions or emotional entanglements. But now he wasn't so sure. He turned the phone over in his hand, hesitating for a moment before searching for Clara's number. He knew he still had it. He had never deleted it. Pressing call, he listened as the line rang several times before going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Ethan hated being ignored, but Clara had always had a way of throwing him off balance. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her small apartment in Queens, exhausted after her shift. She sank carefully onto the couch, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The baby moved and she smiled, a small, genuine gesture, before closing her eyes and letting out a long sigh. Seeing Ethan that night had been a shock, but she had known it would happen eventually. He was a man who always had control, who never let anything slip through his fingers. Seeing the surprise and confusion on his face when he noticed her pregnancy had almost made her laugh. Almost. But the pain was still too raw, the hurt too deep. Clara thought back to how things had fallen apart between them. Ethan was consumed by his career, every second of his life devoted to expanding his company, Grayson Capital. At first, she'd admired his ambition, but over time she realized she would always come second, or perhaps she was never truly part of his priorities at all. They lived in different worlds. She wanted a family, but he had made her feel as though that was an absurd idea. One particular night still haunted her memory. They were having dinner at home, a rare moment together, and she had casually brought up her desire to have children. Ethan had frozen, his fork hovering mid-air as he looked at her with skepticism. "Children, Clara? You know how destructive that would be for us right now. My time is completely consumed, and you know Grayson Capital demands all of my focus." She never brought up the subject again. The idea of having children with Ethan felt as impossible as trying to change the course of a river with her bare hands. So when she found out she was pregnant, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. Their marriage was already hanging by a thread, and she knew Ethan wouldn't see the pregnancy as a blessing, only another complication. Instead of telling him, she made the hardest decision of her life, to leave. Now, as she rested on the couch, her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at the screen. It was a number she knew all too well. Ethan. She ignored the call, squeezing her eyes shut as if that could block out the storm of emotions he still stirred in her. The following day, Ethan strode into his office with his usual decisive gait, but his mind was far from composed. He walked right past his assistant, Megan, who tried to catch his attention to go over the day's agenda. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and began digging for information. It didn't take long to find the basics about Clara, her address in Queens, the name of the restaurant where she worked, but it was something else that stopped him in his tracks. A file detailing the terms of their divorce revealed something he had somehow overlooked before. Clara hadn't asked for a single thing from him. Not a portion of his fortune, not financial support, nothing. He remembered her words the day they signed the papers. "I just want to move on, Ethan." At the time, he had taken it as a relief, but now he couldn't make sense of it. Why hadn't she asked for anything? And why, after everything, did she seem so determined to keep him out of her life? Later that evening, Ethan decided it was time to confront her. He showed up at the restaurant near closing time, seating himself at one of the tables in the back. Clara spotted him immediately, her heart racing as she recognized him. She tried to ignore his presence, but she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. When she finally approached the table, Ethan looked at her with the same intensity that always made her feel vulnerable and irritated. "Can we talk now?" he asked bluntly. "I'm working, Ethan," she replied, her tone firm. "I'll wait," he said, crossing his arms. "I'm not leaving without answers." After a long pause, Clara relented. When the restaurant finally closed, she met Ethan outside on the sidewalk. The streetlights cast soft shadows around them, amplifying the tension between them. "What do you want to know?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. Why didn't you tell me? About the baby? Clara took a deep breath. Because you never wanted children, Ethan. It didn't make sense to bring a child into a marriage that was already falling apart. His brow furrowed. That wasn't your decision to make alone. She held his gaze, her voice steady. And what would you have done? Stayed out of guilt, or worse, insisted that I not have the baby? Her voice cracked slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. I didn't want this child to grow up in an environment where they weren't wanted. Ethan stood silent. For the first time, he had no immediate response. Her words struck him in a way he hadn't expected. And yet, anger bubbled beneath the surface. Not at her, but at himself, because deep down, he knew she was right. I deserved to know, he said finally. You took that from me. Clara looked at him for a long moment before replying. You deserved many things, Ethan, but this child deserved even more. Without another word, she turned and entered her building, leaving him alone on the sidewalk, his mind swirling with more questions than answers. Ethan Grayson couldn't sleep. His conversation with Clara replayed in his head like a relentless mantra, each word from her stirring his conscience. He wasn't the kind of man who admitted fault, much less accepted being excluded from something as significant as the existence of a child. But Clara's words, filled with conviction and pain, made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. What unsettled him most, though, wasn't the pregnancy itself. It was the fact that she believed he wasn't capable of being a father,